This is Health Call Online, the place for extended versions of interviews you hear in our weekly radio broadcast, the Health Call Radio Hour, now appearing on more stations around the country as they join the Health Call Radio Network. There is a very good chance that someone in your family is taking an inexpensive medication to try and prevent cardiovascular disease. Millions more Americans were prescribed this drug, but well, for whatever reason, they didn't refill the prescription or they just decided to ignore the doctor's advice. Well, we may change your mind today as we learn that statins seem to be able to play a role in preventing cancer. So let's learn more about all of this by jumping down to the Duke University School of Medicine and the Duke Cancer Institute, where Donald Mcdonnell is a professor of molecular biology, researching new ways to treat or prevent hormonally active cancers. He's also a recipient of many prestigious awards and has played a role in developing several drugs now in use fighting breast cancer. So I'm glad to have you here, Donald. Thank you.
I'm glad to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics.
Well, let's just jump right there and let's generate a big headline. How confident are you that statins play a role in preventing cancer?
I'm very confident that they have a role in preventing cancer, and I'm even more confident that they improve outcomes in people who have established cancers.
Oh, let's get into detail. I like all of that. So what cancers are affected by statins?
Yeah. So I think really to understand it, let's take one step back and ask a very simple question. How do we get into this? Because that leads us to why we're specifically focused on statins. I think a lot of your viewers will already accept that there's an epidemic of obesity in the country. It is estimated that between 30 and 40% of people are clinically obese. That means that they have more weight than is healthy. And it has been shown also that there are several cancers where there is definitely an increase in getting those cancers or worse outcomes with those cancers if you are obese. Notably, I think everyone will say the data is rock solid for breast cancer, for uterine cancers, for colorectal cancers, for head and neck cancers. And they're the ones that have been looked at most. And I'll tell you maybe later on that I think it's going to expand beyond those cancers. So that's obesity. Okay, and I think that, people can go blue in the face, doctors or physicians can go blue telling their patients to lose weight, and that's going to improve their chances of cancer. But I think what people want to know is they want some quantitation. They want some numbers. They want to know, if I eat a healthy diet, if I maintain a healthy weight, if I maintain my cholesterol, my triglycerides, how much am I going to improve my weight? And I'll tell you that for some cancers, it is pretty dramatic. I mean, 20 or 30% reduction in the incidence of cancers. In fact, I just read one study that was published recently from a study that was done out in Singapore. We have another school, Duke has another school in Singapore, and my colleagues out there were involved in the study where they actually looked at what is the impact of lowering cholesterol, in patients that have breast cancer, for instance. And I was blown away that in that very specific population of patients, it was a large study, there was a 37%, let's be exact, 37% reduction or improvement in overall disease-free survival. Okay, so that's the background, Lee. So how do we get to cholesterol? So as I told you, obesity is linked to cancer. And about 10 years ago, a fellow in my lab, Dr. Eric Nelson, who's now got his own laboratory, University of Illinois, he had a hypothesis that it was not necessarily obesity, fatness per se, but it was one of the sequelae of obesity. And in his one of the things associated with it, it was his idea that cholesterol, that itself was actually contributing to the pathobiology of the cancer. And so think about it. Okay, so a lot of people who are obese are diabetic. Mm-hmm. And they also have got high cholesterol. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are not obese and not diabetic shouldn't listen to this talk, because high cholesterol is high cholesterol. So what Eric did then was he established I'm not going to go through too much science, he did a lot of animal studies where he was able to manipulate cholesterol levels in animals and show unequivocally that cholesterol itself, was causative with respect to increasing risk of cancer and also cancer progression in these animals. And he delved down further, and this is important. And he found that there was a derivative of cholesterol that all of our body, every one of us makes. And just in case there's any scientists out there, it's called 27-hydroxycholesterol. Okay, it's a measurable analyte. And it was that specific part of cholesterol, that metabolite, that was the causative or the driver of the cancer. And so now we've got something we can measure. So that was a long introduction, but I think sometimes history, sets the platform for these discussions.
So is statins' role to prevent cancer or prevent metastasis, the spread of cancer, or both?
Yeah, or it's all of the above. And I think that when we published our very first paper in Science in 2013, it was on this. What we thought was it was going to be primarily useful for patients who had locally invasive or invasive breast cancer. That was what we thought. But now I think as we have delved further into it, we think that it's also going to be useful for the prevention of breast cancers de novo.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it is that one element that you just mentioned that seems to be the trigger.
Correct.
What is that doing? How is that enabling cancer to spread?
That's a phenomenal question, and fortunately, the funding agent, the National Cancer Institute, and the Department of Defense have given us plenty of money to look into this very important question, and we've been researching it. And I can't tell you a full answer, but I'll tell you things. I'm going to tell you things that are rock solid and things that I think. The rock solid thing is the 27-hydroxycholesterol, that molecule I told you about, is actually an estrogen. Okay. I don't think I need to convince any of your viewers that we know that estrogens in a patient with cancer or at high risk for cancer, estrogens are bad. Okay, and so it turns out that a colleague of mine, actually at the University of Texas Southwest, David Mangelsdorf, years ago made the observation that this molecule interacted with the estrogen receptor, but never really pursued it for cancer. And Eric took up the challenge, and what he found was it bound to the estrogen receptor, and now the breast cancer cells or the pre-invasive cancer cells see it as an estrogen. Very interesting. When we published that paper, I got a call from a physician at University of California at San Diego, Dr. Baker, and he said, "I just read your paper, and I would like you to refer you to a paper that I had written a long time ago, actually postulating that this cholesterol was in fact a primitive estrogen, and then in lower vertebrates, it's actually used as an estrogen." So in some respects, although we thought this was an outlandish idea, it really wasn't. We were basically just rediscovering some old biology. So that's estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. So molecule, the cholesterol is converted to this molecule, binds to the estrogen receptor, and then can drive the cancer.
So is it common today that if I am in cancer treatment, am I prescribed statins?
Yeah. So I think for it's one of these things of the law of unintended consequences. So the main reason that women are prescribed cancers, the mate with who have estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, is twofold. One is that most women are menopausal anyway. Okay, and they experience when you cease producing ovarian estrogens, the estrogens are one of the primary suppressors of cholesterol production in the liver. Okay, so women invariably will see their cholesterol levels creep up in menopause. That's the first thing. But secondly, that's compoundedly by the fact that women who have estrogen receptor positive breast cancers or who are at high risk for estrogen receptor positive breast cancers are usually put on a drug called an aromatase inhibitor, which blocks the body's production of estrogens, okay? Or tamoxifen, which basically will compete with at the level of the receptor. And so what's going to happen? Their cholesterol goes up. And so for years, physicians have been prescribing statins as a way to mitigate the long-term impact of hypercholesteremia. Because remember, for most patients who have early-stage breast cancer, to be honest with you, they're going to get their tumor taken out, they're going to have 5 years of an adjuvant therapy, and they're never going to hear about breast cancer again. But they might hear about heart disease. And so you really need to suppress it. So as I said, the law of unintended consequences, the statin wasn't put into these therapeutic regimens to be therapeutic with respect to the cancer, but really to mitigate a sequelae of estrogen deprivation.
So just a happy accident of using, that's
Absolutely.
great. I love it when that happens in science.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So does it matter what statin I'm taking, Lipitor, Zocor, Crestor, any of
Yeah.
it, does it matter?
I would say at this particular point in time, I'm not ready to put a stake in the ground. I think that I vacillate sometimes, basically between a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic statin. So that would be a torvastatin, versus something like rosuvastatin. Okay, but the bottom line is the data is the solid. What data is solid is anything that lowers your LDL cholesterol is going to have this beneficial effects. And in fact, I will tell you then, and you've asked a great question, one of the aims in one of my recent grant applications was to actually ask, is there a benefit to what's called a hydrophilic statin or a hydrophobic, one that acts at the level only of the liver or one that acts more systemically? And I think that's an important thing to address. Intuitively, I think that it's probably going to be, I don't know, a hydrophobic statin. Intuitive. That's just intuitive, okay? Because that statin can get out and go around the body and basically might be able to actually mitigate cholesterol production within the cancer cell itself. But I don't really have any data for that.
And which of those would be a hydrophobic statin?
Rosuvastatin.
Rosuvastatin, okay,
Yeah,
good.
Crestor.
Should I, if I am currently, is it worth mentioning to my doctor, hey, I want to think about Crestor?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just re-emphasize, and I think I've talked about it before. I'm not a physician. I'm a PhD cancer biologist who develops drugs for breast cancer. I know the field very well, but I'm not going to make recommendations as to which statin you should use or not. I think, as you probably know, Crestor. I mean, I take Crestor just because it was the one that suited me best. But I think it's up to the physician and the patient as to which one suits them best, because as you know, they're not the same. People respond completely differently to them, and I think that's actually a very good point to raise, Lee, because sometimes people take a statin, they have a negative experience, and they say, I'm not doing that, right? But I mean, I know personally, I don't mind telling you, I had a bad experience. I did not do well on torvastatin, and then did Crestor, not a bother. And I've been on Crestor for years. Not a bother. So I think...
Yeah, and I just saw some research that said the number of patients who actually have a negative impact from statins is much lower than believed.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that, first of all, I'm 62. I do a lot of running. I cramp. If I'm taking a statin, the first thing I'm going to do is blame the statin. I'm not going to blame it that I'm 62. I shouldn't be running.
Good point. Yeah. What about the impact on colon cancer, prostate cancer?
Yeah. So prostate, I mean, these are areas that we're just going into right now. And I think that, the link between obesity and colon cancer is definite but complex. Mm-hmm. Okay. Some of it has to do with the fact that if you're eating diets that are, high in fat and tend to be high calorific, you're probably not eating a healthy diet, which in and of itself is dangerous in colon cancer. But whether or not cholesterol itself has a specific role in colon cancer, my group has not looked at, and to my knowledge, other people haven't. But something, you raising that question wants me to go out to the lab today and ask the students, anyone interested in looking at that?
And prostate cancer
prostate
is
cancer
another.
Is the same thing. Yeah, I really believe it's the same thing. So it turns out that it turns out that others have actually shown that cholesterol itself. There was a group in Harvard several years ago published a very interesting study showing that cholesterol itself increases the risk of it worsens the disease-free survival in prostate cancer. But again, they never really linked it to 27HC. Again, I think you've just come up with another project for me.
So I'm one of those guys who was prescribed statins, and I stepped away. I'm one of those, millions of people who said, I don't think this is for me. I'm going to try to manage otherwise. You know what? You've convinced me. I'm calling my doc.
Well, I think, so here's the thing, and I use this term kind of flippantly, but semi-serious. I once listened to a very famous physician say that we would be better off from a public health point of view taking fluoride out of water and putting statins in. Now, I know it's flippant, okay? But if you look at it, the risk-benefit, again, I'm emphasizing because I want your listeners to know I'm giving the opinion of a pharmacologist and not a physician. Right. If you look at the risk-benefit ratio, okay, there are risks. There's risks with every statin, every drug you take, okay? But the benefits are overwhelmingly positive. Just think, cardiovascular. We all think about cardiovascular disease. But many of your listeners, and I never, think about stroke. I mean, statins reduce the incidence of stroke, okay? Because because one of the primary causes, one of the of a stroke is blockage of the carotid arteries, which atheromas build up. That's the second one. Okay, we'll put that on the tick as a positive. You never hear people talking about bone. Okay, statins also have a protective effect on bone. And actually, it turns out, I'm not going to go into the science, it turns out it's probably linked to 27-HC as well. We've published some papers on that. Your readers can look them up. So there's another one, tick. And now I'm adding to this that there's compelling data, both biochemical data, research in animals, and now research in the big animals, humans, that shows that statins can actually reduce the incidence of breast cancer. And I think that data is getting stronger and stronger as the number of patients increases that we've looked at and followed. And also, which I think is very important because I develop treatments for breast cancer, is that it seems to improve the outcomes in patients who are diagnosed with cancer. So remember, cholesterol is a building block that's required for all cancer cells. Cancer cells actually contain about 2 times more cholesterol than a normal cell. They are avid consumers or users of cholesterol. So it just makes into this sense.
So we're starving the cancer cell of a key nutrient.
Right. They can make, and so that's it. So they can adapt and try and make it themselves. But if you have a statin on board, they can't. Right, because the process for making you've interrupted the process for making the statin, the cholesterol.
Because you are so closely associated with breast cancer research, tell me what has really got you on fire. You're hot about it. What's the next new thing that's coming that we can be excited about?
Oh, I'm incredibly excited as a breast cancer researcher. I started in this field in 1983. I started doing my PhD at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and that was the time when we didn't even know the different types of breast cancer. Okay, that was you had breast cancer or you didn't have it. Okay, and that was the first. And also tamoxifen, which is, a drug which I've heard a figure used, Lee, which is amazing. This drug was developed by, I won't say developed, it was repurposed by a guy called Craig Jordan, who's now at MD Anderson. And somebody at a lecture for him once said that, and this is several years ago, so imagine what the number is going to be now, that he is responsible for saving 800 million years of women's lives. Okay, wow. So that was back in the earlys. Now let's look at where we've gone now. Now what we've been able to do is been able to divide breast cancer into roughly three usable categories of breast cancer. There's estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, which is about 70 to 75%. There is HER2 positive, which is about 15%. And the remainder then is what's called triple negative. So let's go very, very briefly through these. Estrogen receptor positive breast cancers. If you're if you're a woman who's diagnosed with an early stage estrogen receptor positive breast tumor, the most likely course of treatment for you now is you'll get a lumpectomy. You may or may not get some radiation. You may or may not get some chemotherapy, depending on how big or small or other things your tumor is. You'll be put on 5 years of what's called endocrine therapy, which is either mostly likely an aromatase inhibitor or tamoxifen. And most likely, you will never hear that word again, breast cancer. You never hear breast cancer again. That, to me, is earth-shattering. And so let me just say, so you say, well, what was it before you discovered all these therapies? Well, I don't know the exact numbers, but I can give it the converse. There's about a 50% reduction in recurrence rate of all patients with these drugs. So they're remarkable. Okay. Yeah. Let's just mention, in this category of drug, in patients who unfortunately were not fortunate enough to be diagnosed with local disease or locally invasive, who had metastatic disease, obviously their outcomes are still good but not as good. Okay, and one of the things we've found now is that endocrine therapy, of course, works for those, and then they fail. And so the biggest discovery, I think, is a class of drugs called the CDK4/6 inhibitors. Okay, there are 3 of them. They have all shown to dramatically change the landscape in estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. And then probably one of the proudest moments of my career is that my group identified a drug called elacestrant. It was a drug that was actually originally identified as a treatment for hot flashes. Didn't work. And one of my bright trainees, Suzanne Wardell, and Eric Nelson, the guy I told you from Illinois, discovered that this actually would be a phenomenal breast cancer drug. And we convinced Radius Health, who owned the drug, to actually develop it for breast cancer. It wasn't an easy convincing, but we did. And it was approved in January of this year. And it's going to be followed on by 2 or 3 other drugs of that class. So estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, we've made tremendous, tremendous strides. HER2 positive breast cancer. Now, this is a disease I love talking about in lectures to students, because it's one of those diseases where I think that we can start using the word, a doctor can start saying to a patient, I can cure your cancer, not treat your cancer. Okay. Wow. And I think that the big discovery there, I mean, there's obviously add-ons, but the thing that changed the landscape there was the discovery of a drug called Herceptin. Okay. And then Herceptin, and there's a follow-up drug called pertuzumab, and that's given with classical chemotherapy. And to be honest with you, not, independent of whether we can cure, there are people who are, I personally know people who have been living for, 15 years with metastatic disease who are on Herceptin. And then triple negative breast cancer. That's the one where a lot of the efforts in my group and others are focusing. I know it's only 10 or 15%, but it's usually the disease that is most prevalent in young women and also in women of African American descent.
Highly aggressive, wants to spread.
Unbelievably aggressive. I mean, I just was talking to a young woman. She's 31 years of age. She called me up, and she has metastasis to the brain and 2 young children. And I asked her, I won't mention her name, but I asked her, could I tell her story to my group just to really reinforce them that although we can sit on our high horses with the progress we're making on the other cancers, we really need to get going on this one. But even here, there is some hope. And in fact, about 20% of patients who present with TNBC are treatable with immunotherapy. The big, I think, the next big frontier. And in fact, I'm so pumped about immunotherapy that over 50% of the research in my group has shifted to asking, how can I get the immune system to help me target these cancers? Not only triple negative, and not only breast cancer, but others. But and we have some phenomenally compelling data. We just published some recently on melanoma, which we didn't expect, nice. on how endocrine therapy modulates response to immunotherapies. Yeah.
I love asking guys with your deep background, what have you learned that's affected your life? How do you live differently based on everything you've seen?
That's a great question. I think 2 things. One is, as we talked about earlier, just directly about my my experience with statins. I was encouraged to go back on statins. I stopped using them. My cholesterol went way back up. My cardiologist kept saying, "Come on, Donald," and I kept, "Nah, I'm fine." But when I saw my own data, I said, you're a bit of a hypocrite if you don't start taking your own lessons. And again,
Doctor, heal thyself.
That's right. And of course, then that information drags onto my family. They're sick and tired of listening to me talking about taking their statins and getting their cholesterol checked. That's worst. Second is, I would consider myself a bit of an exercise nut. I mean, not crazy, but I like to run. I try to do something every day. Try to keep my weight down. It gets harder. As I said, it was really, really easy when I was in my 30s. What's the old? I remember the comedian Sinbad used to say that he used to be able to come home from school, eat a packet of Oreo cookies, and he'd still lose 2 pounds. Right? That doesn't happen to us anymore. So I think that is also, exercise, and I definitely eat healthier. But I'm not a nuts and twigs person. I just everything within moderation. And then the other thing, which one of the most gratifying things about my career is doing things like this, Lee, is being able to reach out to people and take complex science, boil it down into a couple of nuggets to help people make decisions about their lifestyle, about their drugs, help them to pose questions to their internist and things like that. That actually is very gratifying.
Well, you've changed my life. I'm going back on the statins based on our conversation, so I thank you for that.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lee.